Okay, so today we are going to continue discussing muscle. We're going to be thinking about metabolism. So on Wednesday, we did a quick review of some of the important parts of metabolism that we want to remember as we start to learn our different types of muscle fibers. We had been discussing how we use energy, or more accurately, I guess, how we produce energy during different types of exercise. And this can be linked up to the types of muscle fibers that we use for different types of exercise. Okay, so we saw that our options for producing ATP are using our creatine phosphate system, using glycolysis, which is anaerobic, happens out in the cytoplasm, but doesn't need oxygen, right? Versus our oxidative phosphorylation, which gets us more energy, but you need mitochondria for that, you need oxygen for that, right? So in light to moderate intensity exercise, over time, you're gonna zero in on producing energy through oxidative phosphorylation, but it takes a little while to get there because these other types of energy production are a little faster to get going. Now, compare this to what happens if we're doing heavy intensity exercise. So like lifting something really heavy or sprinting really hard or something. Okay, so we're going to see the same three types of energy production. Right, so our lines are still creatine phosphate, anaerobic glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation. But what we can see in this heavy intensity exercise is that oxidative phosphorylation never really takes over, right? What mostly happens in heavy intensity exercise is anaerobic glycolysis, right? So we still kickstart things with creatine phosphate, but we've only got limited reserves of that, right? Then we have our glycolysis kick in, and that stays high, right? So we see a bit of a drop as a little bit of oxidative phosphorylation starts happening, but these lines never cross. So heavy intensity exercise needs lots of ATP, but it uses this inefficient way of making ATP, right? So we're only getting 2 ATP on net per molecule of glucose if we're just doing glycolysis and not the rest of our aerobic process, right? So this is helpful if you don't have enough oxygen or if you don't have enough mitochondria, right? But the cost is that you don't get enough energy or you don't get as much energy, right? They've got different energetic costs here. Now, these different ways of producing energy are linked in directly to how we classify different skeletal muscle, right? So different muscle performs different tasks. We use different muscles for different types of exercise. We can adapt a little to different types of exercise, right? And different tasks have different metabolic demands, right? Like certain things are just going to require more energy, right? So when we think about skeletal muscle fibers and we name them and classify them, we're going to be making sure that we are keeping a focus on two things. One thing we're focusing on is how fast does that muscle fiber contract, right? So there's actually a little bit of variation in speed of contraction, how fast those sarcomeres get shorter, right? So that's one thing we're going to be thinking about. So we're just going to sort them into, does it contract fast or does it contract slow? Okay, so that's going to be the first part. And then the other part is that we're going to be classifying them based on how they produce ATP, right? So do they mostly do glycolysis or do they mostly do oxidative phosphorylation? Okay, so we're going to think about that speed of contraction part first. Okay. So when we think about speed of contraction, we know that our contraction of a muscle fiber has to do with sarcomere shortening, right? So that's our sliding filament model. Our actin, our thin filament, is being pulled in by the myosin, right? And the myosin is doing that because we have this cross bridge cycle where our myosin grabs onto actin, uses the power stroke to push that actin towards the center of the sarcomere, and then on the backside picks up new ATP and hydrolyzes it, breaks it in half, in order to reset into its high energy state, ready to do it again. So when we think about fast contraction versus slow contraction at the muscle fiber level, what we're actually thinking about is kind of how fast are we able to hydrolyze ATP. So this is kind of baked in to the fiber itself. We have certain types of muscle fibers that have a faster way of breaking ATP versus a slower way of breaking ATP in this cross bridge cycle. Right? So we're going to refer to our fast twitch fibers. It's going to be our name for our fibers that have a higher rate of myosin ATP ACE activity, right? Sorry, that's where this slide was here. So the ATP ACE, right, means that it's that enzymatic breaking of the ATP, right? So this step where we're taking ATP and breaking it into ADP in that phosphate ion, right? So that's the step where this ATP ACE action is happening, right? So when we're able to do that quickly, we're able to do our twitch quicker, right? This contraction happens more quickly because you can go through more cross-bridge cycles, like per second or per minute, right? Because this is working all a little bit faster. So this faster cross-bridge cycling means you can twitch faster. And these fibers also happen to relax faster too, right? So we get something that looks a little spikier, right? So fast twitch fibers, really useful in something like an eye muscle, right? You want to be able to not have to like move your head around to see stuff. You want to be able to like quickly glance to the side, back to the center. Or if you're following something, your eyes are actually doing jump, 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 jump with their little muscles following the action of a runner or something as you're looking at someone, right? So in those type of muscles, we'd have lots of these fast twitch fibers, right? So contracting quickly and then relaxing quickly so that you can reset to do this again. Our slow twitch fibers are gonna work more slowly, right? So they're gonna break down ATP a little more slowly. They're gonna go through fewer cross-bridge cycles per second or per millisecond, right? And so we're gonna see those in things like the soleus muscle on here is the most noticeable one, right? But you can see our gastrocnemius is also slower than an extraocular muscle, right? So these are big calf muscles we're looking at there, right? So these fibers take longer to contract than a little eye muscle would. They also take longer to relax. So that contraction is happening for like a greater period of time here. So as we go into our second way of classifying muscles, right? So that's the first piece that we're going to be linking in here. So do they contract fast or slow? So we're going to have fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. And then our next piece is we're going to be thinking about, do they do mostly glycolysis or do they do mostly oxidative phosphorylation? And then we're going to jam these two concepts together. So we're thinking about it, right? We're going to be thinking about glycolytic fibers that do glycolysis and oxidative fibers that do oxidative phosphorylation. I want you to predict which one's going to get tired more quickly. Okay, we got a split, but yeah. So what we're thinking about here, I didn't tell you yet, so if you got it wrong, not a problem, right? what we're thinking about here is about that efficiency, right? So our glycolytic fibers, on the whole, we're going to see are going to be strong, but because they're using this method of energy production, the anaerobic glycolysis, that only gets you 2 ATP per molecule of glucose, they're going to get tired more quickly than the fibers that do oxidative phosphorylation and get like on the order of 30 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose. All right, so they're going to be able to be strong, they're going to be able to react quick, but they're not going to be able to be super efficient with their energy use. Okay. So thinking about that, if we have these glycolytic fibers that are tiring relatively quickly, what type of exercise do you think is most likely to be tied to those glycolytic fibers? What do you think they're doing? Are they doing more light intensity activity or more heavy? Let's take a look. Yeah, so this one might be like a little counterintuitive, but you guys did a good job. So we're going to see that the glycolytic fibers are used for heavy intensity activity. And that's going to be due partially to the fact that you can make glycolytic fibers way bigger because glycolysis can happen anywhere in the cytoplasm versus oxidative phosphorylation having to happen specifically in mitochondria and needing all that oxygen. I would also wonder if perhaps this is part of why heavy intensity exercise feels hard. You're not being that efficient with your ATP production. Okay. So when we're thinking about fibers and sorting them out by the way they produce ATP, we have our glycolytic fibers and we have our oxidative fibers. So glycolytic fibers do glycolysis. That's why they have that name, right? So that's going to be tied to the other traits of glycolytic fibers, right? They're going to look a very specific way and have very specific traits that may not immediately be obvious, but do in general have a link into this different method of energy production. So the first one, hopefully, is easy-ish to understand. There's probably that third one on the list too, right? So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, means you don't need mitochondria, right? So a glycolytic fiber isn't going to have that many mitochondria because it's not doing oxidative phosphorylation anyway, right? Likewise, glycolysis does require enzymes. We didn't name them all when we went through metabolism, but they do exist and they are important. So we're going to see that glycolytic muscle fibers have a lot of glycolytic enzymes. They make lots of those enzymes in quantity, so they can do lots and lots of glycolysis. It's not that efficient, but you're doing heavy intensity exercise, so you want to at least try to do a lot of it, right? Because it's not very effective or energy efficient, this also means they're going to need a lot of glucose, right? Compared to something that can be more efficient with its use of glucose in energy production. So glycolytic fiber is going to have a lot of stored glucose in the form of glycogen, right? So that means that when we're only getting 2 ATP per glucose molecule, at least we've got a lot of that glucose saved in our glycogen so that we can keep doing this. Now, these last two are a little trickier. We did just talk about that fatigue one at the end, the quick to fatigue, right? So this is partially because this process is less energy efficient. That's going to make you more tired more quickly. Also the case that maybe you have some lactic acid build up, right? Might also be changing things and changing how you feel, leading to this quick fatigue, right? But this large diameter one is also tied into this ability to do strong movements, right? And this non-reliance on oxygen, this anaerobic quality, right? So when we were talking on Wednesday, right, we saw that different motor units are different sizes, right? Our little small fibers are weaker and they're in our small motor units. And then as we want to make stronger movements, we recruit larger and larger fibers and larger motor units, right? So if you want to do something hard in terms of the amount of force you need, the amount of tension you need to produce, right, it's helpful to have a really big muscle fiber. Okay? So large diameter fibers can be real strong. But if you wanted to do oxidative phosphorylation in a really big muscle fiber, right, you need to get the oxygen to the mitochondria. Right? And a big muscle fiber means that you don't have that much surface area. And the way oxygen gets inside a cell, right, is it's coming in your blood, but then it has to like actually cross the membrane, right? So it has to diffuse across the cell membrane. We don't have transporters for oxygen. We can't like suck oxygen in. This isn't a powered process. It's literally you need oxygen to run into the wall of the cell, right? So having less surface area versus how much you have inside means that it's harder to get oxygen if you've got a big chunky muscle fiber, right? And the other thing is, once the oxygen is in the cell, we don't have like a direct pipeline to the mitochondria. That again has to happen through diffusion, right? So that oxygen has to just kind of float through the cell until it gets to a mitochondria, which is decently easy if you've got a small little cell. But if you're a big, huge cell, right, that's kind of a long way to go potentially from running into the outside of the membrane and then finding your way to a mitochondria. So a large diameter fiber is going to be strong because it has lots of sarcomeres in parallel, and so it contracts a lot. But it would have a big problem if it was really reliant on oxygen. All right, so that's how we can sort of conceptually tie together this diameter piece to this glycolysis piece. Is that the way we get around having a large diameter and that being useful for strong movement versus making it more difficult for oxygen to actually get into the cell is we just switch to a different type of metabolism, right? So glycolytic fibers instead are like, we're going to go all in on power, right? We want to be big and strong. We're going to have this large diameter. So our trade-off here is that we're going to use the type of energy production that doesn't need oxygen. So that's not going to be a problem for us. So that's what a glycolytic fiber looks like overall. And our opposite is going to be an oxidative fiber. So our oxidative fibers, instead of doing glycolysis, they're going to be doing oxidative phosphorylation. So many of these traits are going to be opposite. Right? So instead of doing anaerobic glycolysis, we're going to rely on oxidative phosphorylation. So we're going to see a lot of traits linked to oxidative phosphorylation and making sure you can do as much of that as possible. Which means we're going to have lots of mitochondria, right? Because oxidative phosphorylation happens inside the mitochondria. We are also going to have this new storage molecule called myoglobin. So myoglobin stores oxygen, right? It's storing this oxygen because oxidative phosphorylation happening in the mitochondria does require oxygen as that final electron acceptor. So we're going to see that the oxidative fibers, when we look at like their size, is also going to help us get oxygen a little more easily, but we're still going to sometimes have to deal with a situation where we've started using our oxygen really rapidly and your body hasn't caught up. So we have this myoglobin storing extra oxygen in the cell so it can feed that oxygen into the mitochondria as you're starting to use these fibers more heavily. Now, it happens to be the case that myoglobin has a red color to it. So if you're thinking about like light meat and dark meat when you're looking at your turkey, you now know what type of muscle fiber you are eating. That red color is darker, right? So those are going to be the areas where you have these oxidative fibers. So along with that storage of oxygen, we want to get as much oxygen from your lungs to these oxidative fibers as possible. So we're going to see lots and lots of capillaries. So our little tiny blood vessels are going to come and they're going to surround these oxidative fibers and bring you as much of that oxygen as they can as you are starting to breathe more rapidly and more deeply as you start to do this type of exercise. These oxidative fibers are also going to be adapted to allow lots of oxygen to cross in and penetrate throughout that cell. So they're smaller in diameter here. So these are going to be long, skinny fibers. And the really nice thing about oxidative fibers, while they're not as strong in terms of like how much strength, how much power are you producing when you contract it, like as a large diameter glycolytic fiber, these ones don't really get tired, right? So these small diameter oxidative fibers are a lot more resistant to fatigue because they're a lot more efficient at producing ATP. They have all this oxygen coming in so they can keep doing oxidative phosphorylation. So these ones can go for a really long time. So that's great for our oxidative fibers. So now we link everything together. So we have slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers, and we have glycolytic fibers, and we have oxidative fibers. We only have 3 real type of fibers that exist in your body overall if you look in your muscles. So one of our possible combinations does not exist, but otherwise we're just jamming stuff together. Right? So our 3 possibilities for any individual skeletal muscle fiber is that it's going to be a slow oxidative fiber or a fast oxidative fiber. But then all our glycolytic fibers are going to be fast. There aren't going to be any slow. So we're first saying, how fast can we twitch? How fast can we break down the ATP? And then we're making sure we know whether we've got an oxidative fiber or a glycolytic fiber. All right. So of those, which ones are going to need oxygen? Great. Yeah. So our oxidative fibers are the ones that need oxygen, right? So you need oxygen going to any fiber doing oxidative phosphorylation. If it doesn't have oxygen, it couldn't do oxidative phosphorylation. So both the fast and the slow oxidative fibers need oxygen. The fast glycolytic ones don't, because we're never getting into the mitochondria to do that oxidative phosphorylation in the first place. So we're going to run through them in order. But really all we're doing is pairing the traits that they have because of being either slow or fast twitch fibers with the traits that they get from being either an oxidative fiber or a glycolytic fiber. So when we look at a slow oxidative fiber, we're thinking about something that has low myosin ATPase activity. All right, so we're picturing the cross-bridge cycle, picturing that step. In our diagram up at the top where we break the ATP, we hydrolyze it, and we get ADP, a phosphate ion, and we're resetting into our high energy form. Right, so that would happen slower and less in this slow oxidative fiber. That's the slow part. Okay? But in terms of how we're producing energy, we're really effective, right? So we have high oxidative capacity, this aerobic process. So we need oxygen. We're using lots of mitochondria, right? So slow oxidative fiber is going to have tons of mitochondria in it. we're going to have lots of blood supply. So all those capillaries bringing oxygen to this slow oxidative fiber. We're going to have myoglobin, that molecule that's letting us store extra oxygen. So as you start to exercise, it takes a while for you to start breathing faster. It takes a while to get the gas exchange into your blood, right? So we've got this myoglobin to hold us over and give us that extra oxygen while we're getting everything else into here, okay? And in terms of size, we can see that they're relatively small, right? So small is good for this oxidative piece because that means that the oxygen can penetrate into the cell really easily. But it does mean that this slow oxidative fiber isn't going to produce all that much tension, because the amount of tension you can produce is based on how many sarcomeres you have stacked in parallel, so next to each other. So in a small, narrow, small diameter fiber, you can't pack as many sarcomeres next to each other, right? So that's our trade-off here. We're going to fatigue slowly. We're not going to get tired too quick. We're going to be effective at using our glucose to produce energy, but we're not going to be able to produce that much force, that much tension, because these fibers are going to be a little smaller. Okay. We're going to jump from slow oxidative to the absolute opposite, the fast glycolytic, before we talk about the one in the middle. Okay. So fast glycolytic is going to be the absolute opposite of our slow oxidative. Right? So it has high myosin ATP ACE activity, so cross-bridge cycling really rapidly. It's got a lot of glycolytic capacity, meaning it's adapted to do lots of glycolysis in its cytoplasm. So we've got lots of glycolytic enzymes, the enzymes involved in glycolysis. Plus we've got glycogen in there so that we can grab lots of extra glucose, because we're not all that effective at getting tons of energy out of the glucose. We don't need myoglobin because we don't need oxygen. So these fibers are light in color. That's why they're the white meat in the turkey. But what we're really good at is producing lots and lots of tension. These fibers are going to be strong. So we've got these big, large diameter fibers. So we can do really strong movement. However, we are going to fatigue pretty rapidly because we're going to run out of glycogen at some point, all right? We're only producing 2 ATP per molecule of glucose, and we're potentially building up lactic acid. So we can do a lot of work really quick, but then we're going to have to stop. Okay. So our fast oxidative fibers are the ones that are in the middle, right? So they're oxidative, like the slow oxidative fibers. So we're thinking same method of energy production, but they're fast, like the fast glycolytic fibers. And we see that a lot of their other properties are also kind of in the middle, right? They're kind of bridging the gap. So we're going to see that their myosin ATPase activity, and therefore how fast they're going through the cross-bridge cycle, is a little bit in the middle. Okay? We're going to see they do oxidative phosphorylation, right? So they are going to need oxygen. So that piece is going to be the same as our slow oxidative fiber. And we're going to have myoglobin feeding oxygen into that when we need extra. But we're going to see that our fast oxidative fibers, with their faster cross-bridge cycling, are going to be a little bit larger than our slow oxidative fibers were. They're going to be a little bit stronger. They're still going to be relatively slow to fatigue, like our slow oxidative fibers, but they're going to get tired a little bit faster, right? So again, a little bit in the middle, a little bit on the way to the properties we see in our fast glycolytic fibers. So here we have a table showing us our 3 types of muscle fibers that we can define: slow oxidative, fast oxidative, versus fast glycolytic, right? So we want to know, can they do oxidative phosphorylation? How much do they do? Can they do glycolysis? How much do they do? Are they fast or slow? And we can link that in to how fast they're breaking down ATP, and then linking those different types of ATP production to how many mitochondria they have, how much blood flow they have in terms of those capillaries, whether they have myoglobin, and then thinking about what all this means for how fast they get tired, how big they are, and how strong they are. So when we think about our actual exercising and our actual like big named muscles, we're going to see that any given like large muscle is going to have a mix of fiber types. It's not going to be all one or all the other. The proportions will be different depending on what that muscle does, but you would expect to have some of each of these. A type of muscle that might have more slow oxidative fibers, like an example would be, think about like the muscles helping you stay sitting up all day, like your postural muscles. So think like muscles around your spine and your back, or maybe like your core muscles, right? You don't want to have to be constantly thinking about that, constantly getting tired from just holding your back upright in your chair, right? So that type of muscle is going to have your slow to fatigue fiber in it, right? That slow oxidative fiber, be efficient at using energy because you have to use it all day long, right? And you don't want to get tired quickly, right? But it also doesn't take all that much energy to keep you sitting upright. Okay. So that's the type of fiber you might expect to see with lots of those slow oxidative fibers versus something that's making really strong, sharp movements, more likely to have more fast glycolytic fibers. When we look at motor unit, remember a motor unit is a motor neuron and the fibers it's linked up to. We'll see that a whole motor unit is going to be just one type of fiber, right? So when we think about recruitment and the fact that we recruit our small motor units before our larger ones, right? That means that you are first going to end up using those slow oxidative fibers because they're smaller and they're in smaller motor units than the larger ones, right? You can do recruitment quickly, right? You can step it up to the big one quickly if you need to, but we're going to see that in recruitment order, right? We're always going to go from smallest to largest. So just like we go from a small motor unit to a large motor unit, we're going to go from our smallest diameter fiber, which is a slow oxidative fiber. And then that intermediate one is our fast oxidative fiber, right? So still doing oxidative phosphorylation, but we've got a couple of properties that are a bit more similar, getting us towards the way of these fast glycolytic fibers. And then last, we're going to hit our large, strong, tension-producing fibers with their large diameters, those fast glycolytic fibers. So those would be ones that you'd be using something like sprinting or lifting really heavy weights. Okay. So when we think about resistance to fatigue, right, we're going to be linking that in to the type of fiber that we're using and to the type of exercise that we're doing. Right? So when we think about fatigue, we're going to see the most fatigue when we're doing really high intensity exercise, right? So think about sprinting, think about lifting really heavy weights, right? You get tired quick, right? That's partially because you are using these glycolytic fibers because they have more sarcomeres stacked together, right? They're strong, so they're good for this, but they run out of energy quick because they're only producing 2 ATP per glucose molecule. The other thing is that glycolysis does end up in this anaerobic glycolysis, anaerobic metabolism process, leading to a buildup of lactate, right? So when we think about our full aerobic cellular respiration, we go from glucose through glycolysis, end up with pyruvate, which we would then shuttle into the mitochondria to join the Krebs cycle and eventually do oxidative phosphorylation. But if we're doing just glycolysis, right, we start with glucose, we get ourselves to pyruvate, but we're not going into a mitochondria. So in order to make sure we reset and have enough NAD plus to keep turning into NADH, since that's part of glycolysis, right, we have to turn our pyruvate into lactate so we can keep just cycling through glycolysis over and over again. So we see a buildup of a lactate during these high intensity exercises where we're relying on the glycolytic fibers doing glycolysis. Now, other things that kind of link up are high intensity exercises that produce a lot of fatigue to those glycolytic fibers. Right? In addition to the fact that big fibers are going to have more trouble getting oxygen penetrating into them, it's also the case that if you contract a muscle, right, with a strong contraction, there are blood vessels running through your muscle, right? Like that's how you get blood to them. And as that muscle bunches up, you compress those blood vessels, right? So it's not even just that these fibers are too big to get oxygen easily, also the case that we're kind of cutting off blood flow even as we're contracting. So it's super important that we've got these type of fibers that don't actually need that oxygen. Some other things that lead into fatigue here are neuromuscular fatigue. So as you're sending lots of action potentials to the neuromuscular junction and creating action potentials in the muscle, you can actually deplete how much acetylcholine you have. So you can run out of neurotransmitter, basically, which is definitely going to make you tired, not going to make it possible for you to continue doing this, continue contracting. And we'll see some altered enzyme activity as we do this. Recovery from this high intensity exercise is going to be on the order of minutes to hours, right? Like we can get that blood flow back, we can get our neurotransmitters back, we can build up the enzymes we need and kind of reset in a couple minutes or a couple hours. Now, if you do low intensity exercises to the point that you deplete your body of energy reserves like glycogen, right? You use up all the glucose, you use up all the glycogen, even if the activity itself didn't involve really strong contractions, right? When we think low intensity, might not be like how hard it feels to you, right? This might be like going on a walk for 10 hours, right, is eventually going to deplete you, even if like each individual step wasn't that hard, right? These are going to take a longer time to recover from if what happened is you used up in total your energy reserves, okay? Although also, when we think about like who feels fatigued and how do you get resistance to fatigue, there is a certain aspect of, just your mindset, right? So your mind is surprisingly powerful sometimes, so you can power through some of these things, although I would suspect that depleting your acetylcholine might be kind of hard to get over. All right, so here we see what fatigue looks like in terms of recording tension, right? So if we think about these isometric activities we're looking at here, comparing 3 of them, right? If you have a nice spaced out stimuli and you produce a little twitch in response to each of them, no fatigue there, right? Here, as we're continuing this, either for longer or getting really rapid stimuli in a row, we can see that as we get fatigued, what we're reading that as on a graph is that even when we have twitches happening in response to a stimulus, you're getting kind of weaker and weaker, right? So you're still able to contract a bit, but you're not seeing as much contraction. You're not getting as much of an effect as you get fatigued. And here we're looking at what happens if you exercise and you get to the point where you're producing your maximum tension, right, to the point that you are in tetanus, right? So each and every stimulus is not producing its individual spike, right? We had this summation happening and we're just holding this tension, right? We get tired. So here we see that drop, right? And then we have a rest period. We'll see that often after a period of rest, even if you can get back up to that maximum tension, the next time you do this, you're going to get tired a little faster, right? Fatigue is going to hit you a little quicker if you haven't had a full enough rest period in order to, if you have to build back up your glycogen stores, right? That's going to take longer than if you just have to get oxygen back to your cells or something. A cool thing is that some of our fibers can kind of change into each other, and we can actually respond to the exercises we do as we train for specific types of activities, right? So if you do high intensity exercise more, or if you do a lot more, let's call it aerobic exercise rather than low intensity, because this might still feel hard, right? So more aerobic exercise is going to lead to increased oxidative capacity, right? So if you're doing an activity that you want to do for a longer amount of time, right? Say you're training for a marathon, right? You're doing a lot of running. Hopefully you're not sprinting your marathon because that's not going to go very well for you, right? But as you're practicing longer training runs, you'll be increasing the oxidative capacity of your muscle fibers, right? So you'll be switching more to that oxidative phosphorylation side instead of relying on glycolytic fibers. Versus if you're doing a lot of high intensity exercises, right? So say you are sprinting now and that's what you're focused on, you're going to see less oxidative capacity as you turn to using lots of fast glycolytic fibers. So this is the really cool part, right? Not all our fibers can convert into each other. But the thing that you can't change in a fiber is just how does that enzymatic reaction with ATP work, right? So that part in the cross-bridge cycle where you're hydrolyzing ATP, right? That's kind of like genetically encoded into that fiber, right? So if you're a fast fiber, you're going to stay a fast fiber. But you can switch from glycolytic to oxidative or back, right? So you can take this cell and put more mitochondria in it. You can take a cell and grow more capillaries towards it. Or you could take a cell and make it a little bigger and put in some more glycolytic enzymes so you're better at glycolysis. So these fast glycolytic fibers and fast oxidative fibers can be kind of traded back and forth, adapted one into the other, depending on what type of exercise you're doing, right? So if you're training lots of aerobic exercise, you're going to take some of those fast glycolytic fibers and turn them into fast oxidative fibers so that you can do more of this long-term sustained effort with this more effective use of energy. Versus if you're focusing in on strength, right? You want to be as strong as possible, right? Those oxidative fibers are a bit smaller, a bit weaker. They need oxygen. And if they're compressing the blood vessels as you're contracting the muscle, that's not helpful for you. So you can convert these fast oxidative fibers into fast glycolytic fibers. So we see a parallel change in how many mitochondria you have in those fibers and how big they are. You'd see changes in how big the fiber itself is in terms of its diameter. So if we're switching over to fast oxidative fibers, they need more mitochondria, but they're smaller. If we're switching to our big, strong, fast glycolytic fibers, we don't need the mitochondria, but we can make that fiber nice and big. And we're going to see some trade-offs in terms of fatigue and some changes in terms of blood flow. If you're trying to make a fast oxidative fiber, you better make sure you're getting oxygen to it. Okay. It's also the case that you can kind of kill your muscle fibers. So if you don't use your muscle fibers, they're not going to keep growing. They're not going to really be converting. They're going to be decreasing in size and kind of dying off a little bit. And so they're going to lose some of their myofibrils inside of them. And this can also happen because of disease, right? This might not just be because you're not using them enough. So if you have muscular dystrophy or something, there are also diseases that can cause this kind of wasting as well. Okay, we'll stop here. So on Monday, I know it says activity, but we're just going to finish out with our muscle and muscle types on Monday. So that'll be a normal lecture. But the day we return, which I think is also Monday, I have a doctor's appointment. So I expect a recorded lecture for right when you return.